Hey,
Hello, I'm going to give it just another minute. We've only got a couple people so far.
it's really getting dark outside, isn't it? I
It
remember the
is.
mornings compared to the first.
Yeah, the first meeting beginning of July, the sun was coming up. It's starting to get light out there barely.
Yeah.
We may have a sparse attendance today. It would be reflective of what's happening in the community more broadly as well. It's August in the Northern Hemisphere, and lots of people are going on vacation. Well, we are 2 minutes past. We have a very short attendance today. So I guess what I'll do is I'll give an overview of what we talked about yesterday and then open the floor for questions or comments. Um, so we had a little bit of a discussion about features. Stephen Augustus gave an update, but there wasn't a whole lot of detail there. And it kind of started with me asking the question of, do we have anything that's been decommitted? And would kind of start to expect around now out of this big set that originally was 66 features. Um, as time goes by, things start to fall away because they just weren't being gotten to. So I still think that's going to be the case, looking at some of the features in the list and looking at status on GitHub of things, but nothing formal. So the there was just some back and forth about that. There were a couple in particular that were discussed. Actually, only one of them hit the minutes, but it was more sort of early speculation and nothing concrete had been decided quite yet. So we'll get more specific hopefully in the next couple of weeks. And then by that point, we're getting very close, or in 2 weeks, we're hitting code freeze. So it'll be very obvious at that point if somebody hasn't written code and we're at code freeze, then kind of got to face reality at that point. The particularly big thing this week to call out was in test infrastructure. So when we went through test grid or at the beginning of this month, um, we showed how you can sort of mouse hover over the SIG release tile in the grid and you get a list of SIG release related points, I guess, that you could click on to see test details. And we'd focused on the release master blocking and the release master upgrade there. And in those names, master refers to the master branch. So last week we created the release-1.12 branch, and now there's corresponding testing and test grid that's happening on that branch in addition to master. So in the minutes, I've got those two linked. And at this point, they basically are the same thing as master. We've forked the branch, but daily the content of master is being fast forwarded or merged through Git over to the release branch because we're early in the cycle, and it's basically just a tracking branch. So master test is actually still important. This was a question yesterday. Do we still pay attention to the master branch testing? And yes, we do, because that moves over sort of once a day into the release branch. And it's our initial heads up. If there is something really, really wrong, maybe we wouldn't want to move it. And then once we're into code freeze, we'll stop doing just a simple git merge or fast forward, and it will actually be at some point cherry picks. And at the point we do the release, it definitely becomes cherry picks because then master reopens and we've got 113 development just steaming ahead, and we want to only pull things that are specific key fixes back into 112. So they slowly start to diverge. And actually there is, I believe, just one commit currently on the release 112 branch that's different, because how the APIs are automatically generated, that has to be versioned, and at the point that 112 moves, it's got the 112 versioning, and master can start moving forward potentially. So there's some automation that manages that as well, and you get a commit that's sitting on the 112 branch that is distinct. Any questions about that? I think the way every project handles branch management slightly differently, and this is a slightly unique way of doing things. Okay. Let's see.
Have you noticed any friction or pain points? It is quite interesting because you typically have, I guess, a branch, a release branch that you work on, and then merge that with master. So I'm quite interested to see like the opposite in action.
I don't understand exactly the history of why. I feel like the main friction that I've seen is at the integration point, and especially this usually crops up a little bit later in the cycle. So right now we've got a bunch of work going on implementation, and over the coming weeks, that's really going to start to land. People have to get things in ahead of code freeze. If two or more parties have been working on semi-related code but haven't been interacting, we start to see either merge conflicts or something break in test. And I feel that that's kind of a symptom of not using feature development branches earlier. Because if you have those feature branches, you can enable tests on them, and they become a pre-integration point. So if a particular SIG is working on something big, they can start doing stuff in a particular branch together that's not master. And they can start to prove out that things work there as a unit. And it becomes a point also where you get a little more visibility. If I've heard about SIGFU's working on feature bar, I can go look at that branch. I can clone it, I can check it out, I can play with it, I can see what they're doing. If maybe I've heard that they're doing this particular feature and I wonder how they're going to do something that maybe could impact me depending on the implementation, I can go look at it a little easier when it's sitting there, and I could maybe, if I've got some code that I'm thinking I'll build on top of it, I could start working on that. That's the main thing that I've seen, where we run into late things where they conflict and break, and it backs to a lack of visibility on the work as it was in flight.
But then it sounds like once that conflict has been resolved through like everybody committing into master eventually, I guess, are there any other surprises in the migration from master to the release branch? Is there any additional testing that happens on that level?
The surprises that I've seen have been things that merged accidentally, which is actually kind of amazing. I think given there's like 6 or 7 labels that a lead has to apply to an issue to say, yes, actually merge this during code freeze, and then to have something come back and be a oops, that was for the next release. So there, the branch manager, as they get to the point of doing fast forwards later in the release, ideally we're only seeing a few commits a day, and they can look through them and say, like, does this seem plausible for this release, or something that was maybe more forward? And then we either have to revert that or cherry pick around it. In terms of testing, I think that testing is one of the current concern areas broadly in the project. So like if you look at conformance testing has a pretty low percentage coverage. And to me, that means if we're making a release, we want to know that that release doesn't break users. If you don't have a lot of code coverage there, you can't make a high confidence assertion on that. So that's an area that I think is currently weak, but that hasn't necessarily translated to friction. And I'm not sure if maybe that's because this is sort of like the cloud native build a container, try it, fail fast, fix fast sort of a world. But I, I feel like from an infrastructure, a systems perspective, you you don't want to do that with your cluster. Like you might be okay doing that with the apps on top of the cluster, but moving the cluster is a little harder. Um, yeah, there's something else I was going to say about test. Oh, as I actually see a lot more potential friction going forward. So as most of the code had been in the Kubernetes repo, it's easier to track. And if you get some little friction points there in integration, you notice them more quickly. As we split the monolith into separate repos, something may seem consistent in the KK repo itself, but then later other consumers, whether it's just a development perspective within the project, some integration happens with other repositories. And that isn't something we really are capturing well in the process. So I see friction there in the future. It was a really good question. So so having talked about sort of the release branches and how we do testing, that led into CI signal. And unfortunately, there's no notable changes. We were really expecting to see, based on some comments on a few issues, that things were going to look a little bit better. So sort of the call went out to the team, and especially to Mohammed on CI signal, that we must be aggressive this week on getting responses from the SIGs that appear to be the owning SIGs. So especially on the upgrade tests, he was going to, a little bit later today, attend the cluster lifecycle meeting and talk to them about what we're seeing in test and get a little bit more triage. A few of the things are liable to be cluster lifecycle upgrade itself versus tests that are running in a particular domain after the upgrade has seemingly succeeded. So we need some answers there. And based on that, we should be able to figure out who we talk to next. And we got to get these resolved, because some of them, and some of the issues have been present for 20 days or so, and that's not a good response on the SIGs. And as we get to the through the coming weeks, as much more code is merging into master, if we don't have a clean signal, we aren't going to be able to tell which new code destabilized something. This is just basic software engineering. You have to do that to have velocity. So we got to get this stuff resolved this week. And the worry is that if we don't, then we need to start thinking about elongating the code freeze. And my bias would be to pull it in, so have it start sooner. SIGs aren't going to like that because they're planning to get completion by a certain date, but the alternative is to have the release late. If we release late, especially in this cycle, that means the next release is either going to be a very short cycle or pushes into January, because that release most likely will be kind of the middle of December, right before the end of the year, and there's an awkward gap with holidays through December. So this is starting to be a big risk, and is going to be my key focus for the week, helping Mohammed on this. Bugs, not much to say. We continue to have a low volume of reported bugs, and it's kind of expected at this point. There's not a huge focus on trying to use things that are coming into the release at this point, because it's just a little bit too early. So not seeing reports then of issues. Two slightly new things that we don't normally talk about: docs and release notes. So documentation is hitting a deadline just to open a PR. So in the past, documentation has kind of been a long pole, because everybody tries to get their code written and then they try to add their documentation that's trailing. So it's made it difficult for the docs team to try to pull everything together just at the last minute. So last cycle, we trialed kind of nudging people a little earlier, like, hey, open a PR. Just let us know what files you intend to edit. Like, that's not a particularly onerous task. It doesn't take but a couple of minutes to do. So that seemed like it was successful in the last release, just to get the docs team a little bit of a heads up and some early interactions. And then you have something in GitHub that you can kind of poke people about, like, hey, what's the progress on that? So that deadline is today. The documentation itself isn't due for some time yet, but this is just sort of an initial nudge. So the docs lead and Shadows have been out with the SIGs, poking people on their features and asking for this. And of the so we had 65 features yesterday. Of those, I think they had 7 PRs open. So not a huge response yet, but they're pushing more aggressively yesterday to try to get more folks to meet the deadline today. And then release notes, I checked in just because I wanted to see if Nick had any questions or concerns. And he said, check back in a week or two. And it's early. Right now, not as much stuff has merged, and there's not so many things that have come in with a particular release note tag in the issue or the PR. So a little bit early there, but just wanted to check in. And then the final thing, you all should have seen an email from me yesterday with a proposal about changing code freeze. And actually, I'm gonna just share a little gist with you all with a little bit more detail. In the minutes. So there's been a bunch of back and forth about this between the SIG release meeting, a little bit in SIG PM, and a bunch of chatter on Slack, and then also in some of the release team meetings. Like, is our current process too onerous? Is it redundant? That had led to us turning off the GitHub munger that constantly would nag people about their issues and PRs. And once we turned off the GitHub munger, it was more obvious that we had this whole set of status labels that weren't really being used. And one of those was going to be used if we stuck with the normal way of doing code freeze. So code freeze is mechanically enforced, and the submit queue looks at incoming PRs, how they're labeled and tagged in GitHub. And traditionally, code freeze, one of the labels that was required was this status approved for milestone. I think this goes back a year or so to when these status labels had gotten implemented. But it just isn't really working. And really what you'd often see is we're in code freeze, somebody's come up with a PR, it's clearly good, everybody's approved, and it's not merging. And you see like almost the mashing on the keyboard, like adding of labels, like trying to remember and figure out how do we make something merge in code freeze. Because on the release team, we have a little bit more focus on this. We're thinking about it, but the broader community, random person who opens a PR doesn't know about this. Now your SIG leads and approvers should understand it, but right when code freeze first starts, maybe it's not on the top of their mind. So you'll just suddenly see a flurry of labels get applied where somebody's just trying to assert, yes, I really do approve of this. So given that that's the case, we have 2 seemingly redundant things that we do. 1, we set the milestone on the PR. 2, we label it status approved for milestone. And because those are kind of coming as a pair, my proposal is that we just drop one of them. And at this point, we're not really using those status labels anywhere. So a follow-on, assuming there's no strong objection to this, a follow-on will probably be that we actually drop those labels from our label syncing across the repos in the org. So if you have any thoughts on that, feel free to chime in on the mailing list. Hopefully this is just a little bit of a simplification. And I'll say, I said this a bit in the gist text, and I said it yesterday, I think, as well in the meeting. I'm not 100% happy with this. And I created this just to kind of like socialize it a bit with a few people before making the proposal, because there's a number of people who are really passionate about software engineering process and doing things right. And for the most part, I agree with them, and I agree with the sentiment. Our process here is kind of loose, and we could do better from a process perspective. But if we want to drive process changes in the community, and the current process is kind of feels heavy to people, and they're maybe not project management minded enough to think about, like, there is a point to understanding where we are in the status of an issue as it evolves. They just see friction. they're trying to get their code merged. So I see this as maybe just one little token of goodwill to say, like, hey, those of us who are looking at this, we do actually want your process to be light, to have less friction. So here's some less friction for you. We'll be looking at making bigger process changes in the future to make it a more robust system. But then we kind of set the bar that we intend to keep friction low in whatever we do for process changes. So we'll see how this evolves over time. There's a couple of fairly large proposals sort of working their way through drafting in SIG PM around how to tighten up the process, especially as for features coming in and connecting to issues and PRs. So that was a lot of talking. Any questions or thoughts from the team on that?
I was just wondering which mailing list the email was sent to. I don't think I got it.
It went to 3, to the Kubernetes dev list. Let me just double check that I say this right. To Kubernetes dev list, which everybody should subscribe to if you're not. It went to the Kubernetes SIG leads list, which is just it's a relatively short list of SIG leadership. And then I also sent it to the milestone burn down, which is the list which this meeting is the calendar invite is sent to. So if you have the calendar invite for this, you should have gotten it, I would
That's
expect.
strange. Maybe it was just filtered out. I'll just check.
And let me actually go look and see. Yeah, it does. It did. I didn't look to see, like, did it actually hit the list? Like, you never know if there's a mail hiccup, but it does show in the list archive there.
Okay, I see it now.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, as much as I sent this out to like 6,000 people or something, I suspect like 6 will see it. it's one of those things in a big community with lots of email flying by. You never know how much people see it. I would like to hope that the SIG leads email, the SIG leads at least filter that to hit their eyeballs a little more than just getting filtered away. But and that's a very low volume list. So hopefully it's getting seen. Well, any other questions? I'm expecting things to kind of heat up over the next week. One, we've got issues with tests that we have to get resolved, and then as code starts to merge, the merge volume is liable to ramp up the next 2 weeks, which is almost guaranteed to cause new issues.
Hooray.
All right, well, if no questions or comments, we'll call it a meeting and expect to see some Slack activity and probably email as well around CI issues. All right. Have a great day, everybody.
Bye, you too.
You too. Bye.